Have you ever heard whispers of a secret, almost mythical dinner? You know, the kind of exclusive event that feels more like a legend than a real thing? Well, today we're pulling back the curtain on one of the most wonderfully weird experiments in modern gastronomy, the snus dinner. And get this, the legend around this dinner was so strong, it actually had its own AI-generated mythology, which even cooked up a fake New York Times review calling it a transcendental high-status event. That tells you everything, right? We're not just talking about a meal here. We're talking about a very elaborate, very clever piece of performance art. So, what was this mythical dinner really? At its core, it was an experiment. It was all about smashing two completely different worlds together. The grand world of fiction and the very messy reality of a home kitchen. And this right here, this is the heart of it. On one side, you have the myth, right? This flawless 3-star masterpiece you read about in glowing reviews. And on the other side, you have the reality. A super ambitious, kind of chaotic dinner party being cooked up in a totally normal kitchen. It's that tension, that clash, that makes this whole thing so genius. Okay, so when you've got an idea this out there, this high concept, you have to ask, what's the inspiration? What on earth could be the muse for a project this intense? Let your mind wander for a second. What would you guess? Some rare white truffle flown in from Italy? Maybe some fancy, sustainably sourced caviar? What could possibly be the hero ingredient for a story this grand? Snus. Yep. You heard that right. The entire elaborate, high-concept dinner was an homage to Swedish snus. It's just a perfect, deadpan, beautiful moment of absurdity. Now, for anyone who's not familiar, snus is basically a moist, powdered tobacco product. It's huge in Sweden, and it's deeply connected to working-class culture. It is, by pretty much any definition, the absolute last thing you would ever expect to see on a fine dining menu, and that's exactly the point. Now, before you get worried, let's be crystal clear about something. No one was actually eating tobacco, okay? That would turn this from an art project into a toxicology experiment really fast. The genius here was all in the chemistry, the illusion of flavor. The whole thing was built on this idea of advanced flavor pairing. The chef wasn't treating the snus as an ingredient to be cooked with. No, they were treating it like a sommelier would treat an incredibly expensive bottle of wine, as a complex set of aromas that needed to be analyzed and then copied. And this was their system. First, you analyze the snus with this almost religious reverence, like it's a grand cru. Then you isolate the key things you can smell, the smoke, that earthiness, a little fruit, some citrusy bergamot. And then the final brilliant step. You build completely separate dishes that act as a sensory echo of those specific notes. And here's what that actually looked like on the plate. To get that fruity acidity from the snus, they served a lingonberry drink. To capture those smoky, earthy tones, and this is wild, they infused cream with a literal glowing hot piece of coal. And for that complex bergamot note, they made this crazy dessert with citrus, chocolate, and bacon. The guests were tasting the idea of snus, not the thing itself. But remember that tension we talked about? The myth versus the reality? Well, this is where the story gets beautifully humanly messy. Because the ambition was way up here, but the actual cooking happened down here on Earth. Let's go back to that smoked cream. The vision? Oh, it was a culinary masterpiece. This rich, silky cream just pulsing with the intense, primal smell of glowing coal, perfectly echoing the smokiness of tobacco. A work of art, in theory. And then there was the reality. They later admitted it was a thermodynamic failure. Turns out the coal just wasn't hot enough. So instead of this powerful roar of smoke, the flavor was just a faint whisper. It's just a perfect metaphor for the gap between a huge idea and a regular kitchen. And that wasn't the only problem. The lingonberry drink, it came out a little too sweet. The plating, it looked less like a Michelin star restaurant and more like someone was really stressed out trying to host a dinner party. And maybe the biggest issue, the guests spent the first half of the meal secretly terrified they were being poisoned with actual tobacco. It wasn't until the big reveal that their fear finally turned into fascination. So why? Why go through all of this? What was the point of this elaborate, semi-successful, and probably very stressful experiment? It was all about making a point, a sharp critique of the double standards in the food world. I mean, really think about it. Why is aged grape juice, wine, considered high culture, but fermented malt, beer, is often just seen as simple? Why is ending a fancy meal with an expensive cognac and a Cuban cigar the peak of sophistication, but a pinch of snus is seen as kind of culturally impure? This whole dinner forces you to confront how arbitrary these lines we draw really are. Why do we celebrate some of these things while others that come from similar cultural roots get looked down on? By treating snus with this absurd level of reverence, the dinner was just brilliantly making fun of those invisible hierarchies. And here's the final, most beautiful paradox of all. The chef, the architect behind this entire tribute to tobacco. They're a person who is almost completely free of vices. No coffee, barely drinks alcohol. They approached nicotine not as a fan, but like a pure scientist in a lab, deconstructing it with this detached, deadly seriousness. And that leaves us with a final thought to chew on. The snus dinner was way more than just a meal. It was a mirror. It used flavor and illusion to ask a really profound question about culture and class and what we decide is valuable. And so that question is now for you. What are the lines you draw? What cultural hierarchies do you accept every single day without even thinking about it?